The borders of modern countries were not drawn by politicians. They were drawn by merchants, camels, and spice. Every major nation on earth owes its shape, its cities, its wealth, its very identity, to roads that existed thousands of years before any government did. 7,000 miles. That is how far silk traveled from a Chinese loom to a Roman noblewoman's shoulder. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was a sprawling network of interconnected routes threading through deserts, mountain passes, and river valleys, connecting Chang'an in the east to Constantinople in the west, with hundreds of cities blooming along the way. The cities that emerged along those routes were not accidents. Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, became one of the wealthiest cities on the planet, not because it had oil or gold, but because it sat at the precise crossroads where northern routes met southern ones. Merchants could not bypass it. And so money pooled there. Scholars followed. Architecture followed. Culture followed. Today's Samarkand is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its monuments are still standing because ancient trade made it rich enough to build in stone instead of mud. But the Silk Road did not only carry silk. It carried paper, gunpowder, Buddhism, Islam, the Black Death. Ideas and diseases moved along the same roads as luxury goods, and that biological and intellectual exchange reshuffled the entire medieval world. The reason much of Central Asia is Muslim today is directly traceable to merchants, who carried their faith the same way they carried their cargo, one stop at a time. China understood this leverage. The Han Dynasty did not invest in the Silk Road for cultural reasons. They invested in it to outflank the Xiongnu nomads, who threatened their northern borders, building alliances through commerce that military force could not achieve. Trade was foreign policy, and that logic has never really gone away. The Modern Belt and Road Initiative, China's trillion-dollar infrastructure project connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe, follows nearly the same geography as the ancient Silk Road. The routes are not new. The calculation is not new. Only the vehicles have changed. In the 15th century, a pound of black pepper was worth a pound of silver. That single fact explains why Portugal sent ships around the bottom of Africa, why Spain funded a Genoese sailor's westward gamble, and why the Netherlands eventually became a global empire despite being smaller than West Virginia. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, came from South and Southeast Asia. They moved overland through Arab and Ottoman middlemen before reaching European markets, and every middleman took a cut. By the time pepper arrived in Lisbon or Venice, it had changed hands a dozen times. Europeans were paying enormous premiums for goods they could not produce themselves, and that financial pain became the engine of the age of exploration. Portugal's solution was Vasco da Gama. When his fleet reached the Malabar coast of India in 1498, it did not just open a new trade route. It destroyed the old one. Arab merchants, who had dominated the Indian Ocean trade for centuries, suddenly found themselves undercut by Portuguese ships that could carry more cargo faster, and with cannons mounted on the deck. The Ottoman Empire, which had profited enormously from its position as the land route middleman, watched its spice revenues collapse. The ripple effects were massive. Venice, which had grown fantastically rich as Europe's main spice distribution hub, entered a long, slow decline the moment Atlantic ports became more important than Mediterranean ones. Cities that had been peripheral, Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, became the new centers of global commerce. The economic geography of Europe physically shifted westward, and it has stayed that way. Indonesia's Maluku Islands, the original source of nutmeg and cloves, were colonized specifically because of spices. The borders of modern Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines were drawn in large part by which European power controlled which islands crop in the 16th century. Flavor-shaped borders. Before oil, there was frankincense. For over 1,000 years, the Arabian Peninsula's primary export was aromatic resin, burned in temples from Rome to Persia, used in medicine, used in embalming, used in religious ceremony across every major civilization of the ancient world. The demand was insatiable, and the supply came almost exclusively from southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. The Incense Route ran north from the frankincense-producing regions of modern Yemen and Oman, through the Hejaz along the western edge of the Arabian Peninsula, and into the markets of the Levant and Mediterranean. Every city that sat on that route extracted tolls. The Nabatean kingdom, based in Petra, carved into the rose-red rock of modern Jordan, became enormously powerful because it controlled the northern end of the route. Petra's famous treasury was not built with conquest. It was built with tariffs. Mecca sat on a critical node of the Incense Route. Long before it became the holiest city in Islam, it was a trading hub where Arabian, African, and Levantine merchants converged. The Quraysh tribe, the Prophet Muhammad's own tribe, were traders first. Their wealth and their cosmopolitan exposure to multiple cultures and religions directly shaped the context in which Islam emerged in the 7th century CE. This is not a minor historical footnote. The fact that Islam spread so rapidly across Arabia, Persia, North Africa, and eventually Spain was partly because the infrastructure of trade already existed. Merchants who converted carried the faith along routes they had already traveled for generations. The Incense Route's network became Islam's early expansion network. Yemen today is one of the poorest countries on earth. It is hard to look at its ruined cities and imagine that this was once a place wealthy enough that ancient writers called it Arabia Felix, happy Arabia. The frankincense dried up. The route shifted, and the wealth went with them. At its peak in the 14th century, Musa Musa of Mali was almost certainly the wealthiest individual who ever lived. Medieval historians estimated his fortune in terms that do not translate cleanly into modern numbers. But when he made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought so much gold with him that he caused inflation in Egypt for over a decade simply by spending freely. Gold prices crashed across the Mediterranean because he gave too much away. All of that wealth came from the Trans-Saharan trade routes. West African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, sat on top of enormous gold deposits, but they needed salt, which was extraordinarily scarce in the forest regions of West Africa and extraordinarily abundant in the Sahara. The trade was almost absurdly simple. Gold moved north, salt moved south. But the scale and the organizational infrastructure required to move goods across the Sahara were staggering. The cities that emerged at the southern edge of the Sahara, Timbuktu, Jin, Gao, were not remote backwaters. Timbuktu had one of the largest universities in the medieval world. At its height, it held over 25,000 students and housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. The manuscripts are still there, many still being cataloged, in a city that most modern people associate only with remoteness. The Arabic word for the region, the Sahel, means shore. It was understood as the southern shore of the Saharan Sea, just as the Mediterranean was the northern one. Ships crossed one sea with sails, caravans crossed the other with camels. The logic was identical. When Portuguese ships began accessing West African gold directly through coastal trade in the 15th century, they bypassed the Trans-Saharan routes entirely. The Saharan cities lost their economic reason to exist. Timbuktu's decline mirrors Venice's decline. Same cause, same mechanism, just a different ocean doing the disrupting. Trade routes do not disappear. They just route around you. Every country you can name today was shaped by people moving goods from one place to another. The merchants did not intend to build civilizations. They just wanted a profit. And the world they accidentally constructed is the one we still live in. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. There are a lot of roads left to travel.